I want to concentrate on Nisbet, the piece that's been mentioned before from the first 2 issues of the Scottish Chapbook. I've described it, maybe provocatively, as a short dramatic trialogue for 3 characters: Duthie, the man who asks questions; Nisbet, back from the dead, killed in 1915, although this isn't literally mentioned in the piece; and Young, an asinine pontificator. Their encounter engenders an opening of inquiries. Revolutions in Ireland and Russia, sexual repression and proto-feminism, diversity and uniformity, body and soul and what belongs to Caesar, nothing, and leaving home behind. So I want to read this thing, and I want to have the text in front of me as I do, because it's so, at first, perhaps difficult or resistant to a deeper reading, and therefore to be selective about how one might read it and highlight these aspects of it. I think it would be useful just to have the text in front of us. But before I do that, I want to mention the fact, and I'm indebted here to Graham Eddy, the archives of the Edinburgh University Library, for his note. The dramatic trialogue as such might be imagined as a short story or a play, to be enacted. In either case, the presence of voices in conversation is paramount, and a sense of disembodiment creates a spooky, atmospheric ghostliness, obliquely confirmed in unemphatic asides. Now, if the technology is with me, I'll share this first of all. And this is the logo of an operation called Project Theatre, which actually put on Nisbet as a production in Glasgow in 1932. And the director, Frederick Grant, who directed this on the 23rd of December 1932, described the set as a backcloth in symbolic design depicting piles of tenements and everything that is loathsome of Glasgow. Commenting in a letter that he didn't think, in a letter to MacDiarmid or to Grieve, that he did not think that Grieve or MacDiarmid could have ever intended it to be performed, but that in fact some of the passages came out very well indeed. But as you may agree, there was a lack of theatre. Nevertheless, the experiment was interesting. Now, if I can move that to this, what you should see is the review, which appeared in the Daily Record on the 24th of December 1932. And it kind of confirms Grant's opinion. There's little in the way of dramatic theatricality, but the language, engagement, and bagatelle of ideas is constant. And within the theatre of ghostly presence, its impact might be strong and curious. So much is noted in the review, where it's described as, quote, a cerebral puzzler that came rather fast for most of the audience and was practically devoid of action, although it presented a pretty problem in adjustment. You can just see that, I think, there at the end of that first paragraph. This strikes me as a really important word for this piece of writing. Adjustment, in fact, could be the conundrum at the heart of the piece. And the autobiographical convictions expressed by MacDiarmid, or rather, at this stage still, Christopher Murray Grieve, enlisted in the Royal Army Medical Corps in July 1915, spending a year in England before being posted as a sergeant to the 42nd General Hospital in Greece. He published some of his earliest poems, in the local newspaper, in the Eskdale and Lidsdale Advertiser, the town he came from. And the early poems are in tune with those expressing familiar tones of sympathy, encouragement, while the poet remains longing to fight, honouring the fallen. And it's important to consider this context of his enlisting immediately after Nisbet. We'll come back to Nisbet himself in a moment. Immediately following Nisbet and going to the First World War with such things in mind. So in a wee early poem to Private John Ruddick, the Australian Expeditionary Force wounded at the Dardanelles, he writes, I wondered if far off beneath the Southern Cross, your heart was torn as mine beneath our Scottish sky, watching the way my schoolmates played their part, while I, all powerlessly, stood by. But by 1915, June 1915, the tone in these early poems is very different. June's golden heart is torn in twain. Her glad blue eyes are grey with tears. Her radiant face is white with pain for the lost promise of the years and the Christ crucified again. So if that's June 1915, note that in April that year, Grieve's best friend from before the war, John Bogue Nisbet, had been killed in the trenches of the Western Front at the age of 23. Grieve was invalided home in 1918 with cerebral malaria, and 7 years later, in the first issue of his magazine, The Scottish Chapbook, as Scott pointed out, under the name of Hugh MacDiarmid, his first published works were these conversation pieces, or piece, in 2 parts, Nisbet, an interlude in post-war Glasgow. The dead soldier, former school friend, gassed to death in France, returned and is thinking about poetry and sound in the industrial Scottish city, and what might make a new insubmersible sort of song. It's characteristic of MacDiarmid to draw that vision of what the future might bring out of the horror and loss of the past. And his description in Annals of the Five Senses, that was to appear in 1923, gives us some sense of that retrospective understanding of the world that he was emerging from, just prior to his publication of Nisbet. How would he describe the battlefield of the Somme? A broad road leading through an open country, rising and falling in conformity with the configuration of the ground. A long stretch of that road covered with traffic of all kinds. Huge guns being dragged along by heavy tractor engines. Great motor wagons in an interminable line, carrying food, ammunition, clothing. Men marching towards the front, either fresh from their training or returning from rest camps, making once more towards the hell of the trenches. Others returning from the battleground covered with a caking of mud, and yet fretted with an odd cheeriness, despite the strain through which they had passed and the bitter cold that bit to the bone. Long strings of horses. This was the very heart of the trench-crossed, shell-pitted, mine-caverned battle area. As far as the eye could see on each side of the road, there was nothing but desolation. Out of this devastation, a new resolution was rising in MacDiarmid, and he wrote of himself in the Annals. He came back with an idée fixe. Never again must men be made to suffer as in these years of war. As Homi Bhabha puts it in his essay, Interrogating Identity, the state of emergency is always also a state of emergence. So what of this interlude? I'm going to keep the text in front of us as I read on, just to refer to 1 or 2 items in it. I know you won't be able to read it all, and I'm not expecting you to read it all or for me to read it all, but just to highlight 1 or 2 things as we go through. An interlude. Why interlude? The word itself suggests an in-between moment, precisely located after the war and before whatever happens next. And the last line, as we'll come to it, states baldly that the direction of travel for everyone is the same, further and further away from home. So in this limbo world, we begin at a street corner where direction will change and meetings happen unpredictably. Duffy appears greeting and presumably holding on to Nisbet's hand, as if having just met him, and at the same time gripping him so that he won't be lost. And he's speaking as if to himself. He asks questions of Nisbet and of himself. It's as if Nisbet is part of himself, a finer part, perhaps less given to mundane or even practical matters, asking what breeds likes and dislikes only reinforces his sense of the inexplicability of the world. Meeting people one doesn't know, never will know, is constitutionally incapable of knowing, is extraordinary, he says, but it happens 1,000 times a day. But Duffy has a sense that Nisbet shouldn't be here, and comments that he seems not to be there at all, except physically. For his part, Nisbet recognises in Duthie a character who is selective and striking in the peculiar run of his ideas. He urgently wishes to talk and is constantly prodding and pushing, asking questions and making pronouncements to see what response they might prompt in Nisbet. Nisbet admits that he has lived all his life in Glasgow, bar the army. Duthie remarks on Nisbet's apparent lack of personality. That's why you look so disturbingly odd. You're still a mere individual. Nisbet, if this is evocative of a character, a ghost back from the dead, killed in 1915, maintains a mysterious presence, an ambiguous presence in the whole playlet, undisclosed and without reassurance. When Duthie advises him, and it's just around there, making money by writing for the People's Friend and getting 7 and 6pence a column for a column of verses is better than having a score of epics in his head. Nisbet responds that he can express himself all right, but what he has to say isn't printable and might not even be intelligible. So are we witnessing an encounter between C.M. Grieve, the working reporter, working journalist, and trying to make some money by his writing, and a ghost of MacDiarmid, who knows that there are books unwritten in his own imagination? It appears to some extent that this is the case. Also, I think the echo there is of Ezra Pound's Mr. Nixon in Hugh Selwyn Moberly from 1920, who advises the aspirant writer to give up poetry, my boy, there's nothing in it. Is Duthie, in some respects, the working reporter, the poet also trying to make a living? Is Nisbet the idealized poet incapable of material presence or commercial priorities or success? And is Young, when he comes along in a moment, the Philistine nemesis of both? When Young enters, Duthie introduces him to Nisbet. This is Nisbet, Young, aside. It's like saying Jesus, Judas. Nisbet and I were together in France. He was gassed in a whisper, body and soul. He's not like me. And this leads to the most intense moment so far when Duthie asks Nisbet if he'd join up if there were another war. And I wonder if I can, you can just see it at the bottom of that page. Would you join up if there were another war? I'd see the king, ... Clatter of a passing motor van makes the remainder of the remark inaudible. Young's take on Duthie is scornful. You're not a human being, you're a mere sorting house. But Nisbet, when pressed, returns to his otherworldly and exemplary symbolic presence. I am constitutionally incapable of rendering any more to Caesar. Nothing is his, and that's all he'll get from me. When Young asks Duthie to describe Nisbet to him, Duthie says he's a poet, but he complains that modern Scottish acoustics are so bad that it isn't worthwhile trying to make himself heard. He's trying to invent a new insubmersible sort of song. Very close, I think, to Paul Valéry's Monsieur Test, who MacDiarmid refers to later on, creating a poetry that cannot be expressed, or dreaming of it. They witness a dogfight that develops into a battle between a drunk Irishman and a pregnant woman, which prompts Nisbet to speculate how it's possible, how is it possible to go home and write verses having seen such things. In Glasgow, Nisbet tells us, sin isn't ever original, it's mechanical. The city, he says, like every other city, is a cannibal that feeds on its own children. And the echo here, it seems to me, is from James Joyce's Stephen Dedalus in The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man from 1916. Do you know what Ireland is? Ireland is the old sow that eats her farrow. And yet, when asked about politics, Nisbet demurs. I'm not interested in politics. Duthie remonstrates, confirming his own more conventional attitude, while emphasizing the political understanding that he believes Nisbet will develop. I'm a mere conventional worm, quite pleased to become another Neil Monroe or wee MacGregor, says Duffy. It's a persona, a projection of MacDiarmid's satirical voice into a character for once, not MacDiarmid. But it's different with you. That's why you look so inappropriate here. The potential Duffy sees in Nisbet becoming politicized is dangerous. But Nisbet seems to acknowledge some truth in it when he says, all forms of literary and artistic expressions, equally with other phenomena of intellectual and spiritual activity, have reached in our Western civilization the point beyond which they can go no further. Western Europe, with America, has exhausted her energies, as Greece, Rome, Assyria, Babylon. Duffy adds anxiously, don't forget Peru. And Young intercedes, sensing that Nisbet is finding his voice. And Nisbet goes on. Exhausted their energies before her, she can add nothing more to the sum of vitally new human knowledge of fresh and adequate channels of self-expression. We must wait. And Duffy muses for the inevitable end. And Nisbet corrects him, or rather the new beginning, which will come from a civilization other than our own. Young now comments this really curious passage at the top of that page right there. Yeah. Young now comments that he thinks renewal is coming, but from Russia. An assurance given to him by an unseen character, doesn't appear in the sketch at all, named Moira, who seems to embody a female national identity analogous to Dark Rosaleen in Ireland, thus bringing into the discussion the idea of a resurgent and emancipated women's movement, a sense of the precedents in self-determination set in Ireland and the socialist revolution, and before that, spiritual revolution symbolized by Dostoevsky. All of these hints and suggestions are supplied by a retrospective reading of what comes after this piece. They're not hugely intrinsically present in the piece, but I don't see how we can avoid them. I think what we're looking at here is a sketch of great interest that still needs to be teased out much further than I've been able to do here. But Nisbet keeps shy of any commitment, saying nothing about Russia or Moira, and rejecting the Irish example, interestingly, in terms similarly reminiscent of Joyce's Stephen Dedalus. My soul is no shillelagh. Deirdre was Mrs. Grundy's maiden name. That is, whatever he might be investing in spiritual identity, it won't be marched to a flag, and even the most independent of Celtic women, Deirdre herself, might transform into the life-denying Puritan of female self-suppression, and that in itself might symbolize Scotland. Young, the asinine pontificator, ends his contributions with a bad pun and self-satisfaction. Duffy bids Nisbet farewell as his companions, and as his companions leave, he comes to the end of his own speculations. Just at the top of that page there. It's easy enough to say that little is worth studying than the development of a soul. But the trouble is to tell just whether it's a soul or not that you're looking at, and then to discover what constitutes development, and so whether there's anything to study or not, looking round dissatisfiedly. How can one be sure of anything in this light? What we know of John Nisbet from Alan Bowles' biography is tantalizingly brief. He was Grieve's closest friend at Broughton, but 1 year his elder, born in 1891 in Berwickshire, and he was a writer of some promise, with what Bowles calls a chilling tale about death and disaster in a fishing village in the Broughton magazine, Seaweed and Sand. The passage Bowles quotes in the biography is powerful. Grieve and Nisbet spent the summer holidays of 1909 camping and cycling in Berwickshire, and Grieve called him infinitely more than a brother, a very spiritual familiar. Both were keen on international poetry, socialism, and evidently the geography of the borders. Nisbet was to start an honours English course when he became secretary, then president of the Fabian Society. He graduated from Edinburgh in 1914, was appointed to teach at George Watson's Academy, but instead joined the Royal Scots and was sent to France on the 17th of February, 1915. The Edinburgh Evening News of the 22nd of April reported that he'd been killed on the 13th of April. I'll finally quote briefly from a letter that Grieve wrote to George Ogilvy on the 20th of August, 1916. What Nisbet was to me although for long before his death we had not met nor corresponded. I cannot define. Infinitely more than a brother, very spiritual familiar. One of the many contrasting personalities in me was essentially Nisbet, thinking in me with his brain, working in me with his splendid sensuous vitality, reflecting upon the other personalities, part and parcel of the debating society, which is my mental life. He must not go undedicated. I have the very poem, for poem it must be without saying. It trembles on my tongue. At times, in semi-sleep, I can read it in the volumes of my subconsciousness, as from a printed page. Perfect, adequate. But I have not yet contrived to write it. Must I forever plan what I shall never execute? I am tortured worse than any Tantalus. That's a letter from 1916. Their encounter in the pages of the Scottish chapbook engenders an opening of inquiries. Revolutions in Ireland and Russia, as I said at the start, sexual repression, proto-feminism, diversity, uniformity, body and soul, and what belongs to Caesar, nothing, and leaving home behind. In this experimentation, a willing risk, not knowing will come of his writing and his publishing it. We might have a clue to MacDiarmid's method of investing emotional autobiography into depersonalized play. And I hope this kind of links back to questions that might have been raised by Patrick at the start about the inquiry, the nature of the play of the inquiry, and piecing together those early Scots poems. But also I want to bring into that sense of an emotional investment, which is personal, but has to be worked out, teased out, identified accurately. That element of play is neither conventionally engaged in a direct self-representation, nor explicable by psyche or character, but it suggests something else: the discovery of new ways of articulating emotional investment in the self-extinction of identifiable individualism. That would be, indeed, leaving home behind. Thanks.